She had not expected the roses to still be blooming. 3 years was a long time, long enough for a man to go to war and come back, changed beyond recognition, long enough for a family to fall apart quietly, without anyone outside noticing, long enough for Evangeline Stern to learn how to carry herself like someone she was not. She stood at the servants' entrance of Caldwell House with a carpetbag in one hand and a letter of reference in the other. A letter she had written herself, in a handwriting that was not quite her own. The paper was good quality. She had made sure of that, old habits. The housekeeper who opened the door looked her over with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had assessed dozens of girls before her and would assess dozens more after. "Miss Stern?" "Yes, ma'am." "You come recommended from the Wexford household?" "I do, ma'am." None of that was true, of course. There was no Wexford household. There was no recommendation. There was only Evangeline standing in the gray October drizzle at the back door of what had once been her mother's house, asking to be let in as a kitchen maid. The housekeeper, Mrs. Croft, she would learn later, a tidy woman with silver hair pulled severely back and eyes that missed very little, studied the letter for a moment longer than was comfortable. "Your references are in order," she said finally, and stepped aside. Evangeline crossed the threshold. She did not look up at the window above the entrance, though she knew exactly which room it belonged to. She had looked out of that window as a child, watching the gardeners below, and thinking about how small everything seemed from high enough up. She did not think about that now. She kept her eyes down and her breathing even, and she followed Mrs. Croft into the warmth of the kitchen. Her mother had died in the spring. Not suddenly. Nothing about it had been sudden. It had been a slow loosening, the way a knot comes undone when you pull at it gently over many months. Lady Aldmere, her mother, had kept the title even after the remarriage, had spent her last weeks in a borrowed room in Halifax, attended by a cousin who was kind but not close, and by Evangeline, who was both. The solicitor's letter had arrived 3 weeks after the funeral. Evangeline had read it twice, then set it down on the table in the cousin's small kitchen, and looked out at the harbor for a long time. The estate, Caldwell House, the land, the income from the tenancies, had been left entirely to her stepbrother. This was not a surprise. It was not even, strictly speaking, wrong. The law was the law. But what was wrong, what had kept her awake for many nights since, was a clause near the end of the letter. A clause pertaining to a private agreement made between her late stepfather and a neighboring family, the terms of which had never been explained to her mother, and which, now that her mother was gone, could not easily be contested. Her share of her mother's personal estate, the jewelry, the small trust left by her own father, the things that had always been understood to be hers, had been transferred to her stepbrother Prentice. She had written to Prentice. He had not replied. She had written again. His solicitor had replied instead, in language so cordial and so final that she understood immediately. There was nothing more to be said through correspondence. She had thought about it for 2 weeks. Then she had packed a single bag, written herself a reference, and taken the post-coach south. If she could not get answers through letters, she would get them by being present, and if she could not enter Caldwell House through the front door, she would enter through the back. The kitchen was run by a woman called Cook. Evangeline never heard anyone call her anything else, who had a sharp tongue and a surprisingly light hand with pastry, and who made it clear within the first hour that she tolerated no nonsense and no excuses, and that if a girl was going to cry, she was to do it outside. Evangeline did not cry. She scrubbed pots and peeled vegetables, and learned to move quietly through the back corridors of a house she had known since childhood, pretending not to know which floorboard creaked outside the library, pretending not to recognize the portrait of her grandmother in the second-floor hallway when she was sent up with fresh linens. The other kitchen maid, A girl named Betsy with freckles and an easy laugh showed her where things were kept and which of the footmen were worth speaking to and which were not, and told her in a low, conspiratorial voice that the house had been strange since the Duke came home. "Strange how?" Evangeline asked, though she had already heard pieces of it from Cook and from the boy who brought the coal. "Quiet," Betsy said. "He used to have people round all the time before. Hunting parties, dinners. Mrs. Croft said they'd have 60 for supper, and it wouldn't even be considered grand. Now he barely comes down." She lowered her voice further. "Oswald, the first footman, he says his grace doesn't sleep, says he walks the corridors at night." Evangeline said nothing. She had known Calloway, the Duke of Caldwell, slightly before. He had been her stepbrother's friend at university, had visited the house once or twice when she was perhaps 15 and largely invisible to young men who were not yet thinking about girls her age. She remembered him as someone who laughed easily and loudly, who had a habit of draping himself over whatever furniture was nearest, who had seemed entirely without shadows. That was before the war. She knew what war did. She did not know what it had done to him specifically, but she knew that whatever it was not her concern. Her concern was Prentice. Her concern was finding out where the trust documents were kept, whether the private agreement had ever actually been formalized in writing, and whether there was any legal path forward who she was, and be turned out into the street immediately. She was not here for the Duke. She told herself this clearly as she fell asleep that first night in the narrow servant's bed with the October rain against the window. She was not here for him. She saw Prentice on her third day. He came down to speak with Mrs. Croft about the week's menus, which struck Evangeline as unlikely. Prentice had never shown any interest in domestic arrangements before, and she understood from the way Mrs. Croft's expression shifted almost imperceptibly that he was there for some other reason, and using the menus as a pretext. She kept her eyes down. She was carrying a tray of polished silver from the dining room back to the butler's pantry, and she moved carefully through the corridor while Prentice and Mrs. Croft spoke in low voices near the green baize door. He looked well. That was the first thing she noticed, despite herself. He looked better than he had at their mother's funeral, where he had appeared briefly, spoken to no one, and left before the burial. His clothes were good. His manner was easy. She hated him thoroughly and efficiently, the way you hate someone you have loved for a long time and then been betrayed by without warning. He did not look at her. Why would he? She was a kitchen maid with her hair pinned back under a cap and her hands reddened from the washing up water. She was no one. She kept walking. She did not break a single piece of silver. Later in the kitchen, she asked Cook, as casually as she could manage, whether Mr. Prentice visited often. Cook sniffed. Often enough. He's friendly with his grace from before the war, I mean. Comes round to check on things, he says. Another sniff, this one more expressive. Checks on the wine cellar mostly, if you ask me. Evangeline did not ask anything further. She stood at the sink and scrubbed a pot that was already clean and thought about the trust documents and where they would be kept. The library was the obvious answer. The library or the study. Both were rooms she could not easily access without a reason. She found a reason on the 6th day. The under-housemaid, a quiet girl named Dora, developed a cough that Mrs. Croft declared too persistent to risk spreading through the upstairs rooms, and Dora was sent to bed with honey and orders to stay there until she was well. The upstairs duties were redistributed. Evangeline was assigned the library. She went in the morning when the house was still quiet. The library at Caldwell House ran the full length of the east wing on the ground floor, with 3 tall windows looking out over the kitchen garden. Evangeline had spent a significant portion of her childhood in this room. Her mother had encouraged reading, without quite understanding it herself, and Evangeline had worked through most of the shelves between the ages of 9 and 17. She dusted methodically. She did not rush. She looked without appearing to look. The desk was in the corner, a large partner's desk that had been her stepfather's. There were papers on it, but they were recent household papers, invoices, estate accounts. Nothing that would tell her about a private agreement made years ago. The documents she needed would be filed somewhere. A cabinet. A strong box. Somewhere locked. She was examining the built-in cupboard beside the fireplace. Locked, naturally, when the door opened. She turned. The Duke of Caldwell stood in the doorway. He was taller than she remembered. Or perhaps she had simply been shorter at 15. He was wearing riding clothes that suggested he had been up since before dawn. And his face was. She searched for the right word and could not find one that was adequate. Tired was not strong enough. Aged was not quite right either. He was perhaps 28 or 29, and he looked, in that moment, like someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and had stopped expecting to be able to put it down. He looked at her with an expression that was not unfriendly, exactly, but was very still. "I didn't know Dora was unwell," he said. He had a low voice, the kind that did not carry. "Since yesterday, Your Grace. Mrs. Croft has her resting." He nodded. He did not leave. He came into the room and went to the desk and stood looking at the papers there without sitting down, and Evangeline returned to her dusting and tried to make herself invisible. It was something she had become reasonably good at. "You're new," he said after a while. "Yes, Your Grace. A week." Silence. "What's your name?" "Sternin, Your Grace." Another pause. She did not look at him. She was dusting the same shelf twice. "Where are you from, Stern?" The question was mild, conversational. There was no reason for it to be dangerous. "The North," she said, which was true as far as it went. He did not ask anything further. He took one of the papers from the desk, read it, set it back down. Then he left. Evangeline exhaled. She stood very still for a moment, listening to his footsteps move away down the corridor. Then she went back to looking. She found it on her second visit to the library, 4 days later. Not the document itself. She had not expected to find that easily. But she found a letter tucked inside a book that had been placed on the desk rather than shelved, which suggested it had been read recently and set aside. The letter was from a solicitor in Edinburgh. It referenced, in passing, the personal estate transfer and the private agreement of 1891, and it mentioned, almost incidentally, that the original documentation was held with Mr. Alderton. Evangeline did not know who Mr. Alderton was. She asked Betsy that evening, as casually as she had asked about Prentice. "Mr. Alderton?" Betsy said, thinking, "Oh, he's the solicitor for the estate. Old man, comes round every quarter, very dry. Has a dog that bit the second footman." A solicitor. The documents were with the estate solicitor, which meant they were not in this house, which meant she could not simply find them and read them, which meant she needed something else, access to the solicitor's office, or someone with standing to request the documents be produced, or... She stopped that line of thinking. She needed to think clearly. She was good at thinking clearly when she was not frightened, and she was only a little frightened. She was more angry than frightened. She thought about it while she peeled potatoes. She thought about it while she made up the library fire. She thought about it in her narrow bed, listening to Betsy's quiet breathing from across the room. The answer, when she reached it, was uncomfortable. She needed to speak to the Duke, not as Miss Stern, the kitchen maid, as Evangeline Aldmere, whose mother had lived in this house for 11 years and whose inheritance had, she believed, been improperly transferred. She needed to tell him who she was. She needed to ask for his help. She lay awake for a long time after she reached that conclusion, staring at the ceiling and hating how much she did not want to do it. She did not do it immediately. She was not sure yet whether she could trust him. Trust was not something she extended easily these days. What she did instead was watch. She watched how he moved through the house. Carefully, she thought, as if he had learned to take up as little space as possible. She watched how he spoke to the staff, directly, without condescension, but without familiarity either. She watched how he was with Prentice, on the 2 occasions Prentice visited during those weeks, and what she saw surprised her. He was not warm with Prentice. She had expected warmth. They were old friends. Betsy had said university friends, but there was something in his manner that was more duty than affection. He listened. He answered questions. He did not seem, to Evangeline's careful eye, to enjoy the visits. She filed that away. She also noticed that he came to the library every morning, very early, before the household was properly awake. She knew this because she began coming to the library early as well. Not to watch him, she told herself, but because the early mornings were the only quiet time, and the library fire burned steadily, and it was a good place to think. The first morning she arrived to find him already there, she nearly turned and left. He looked up from the book he was holding. "You don't need to go," he said. She hadn't said anything. She hadn't even moved, she thought. "I've seen you here," he said. "Early. I think we've been sharing the room without knowing it." She wasn't sure what to say to that. "I find it difficult to sleep," he said. It was not an explanation, exactly. It was more like a fact being stated to the room rather than to her. "The library it is quiet here. Yes, Your Grace. You can stay, if you find it useful." She stayed. She had not expected that, and she was not entirely sure what to do with it, so she sat in the chair near the window that she had always thought of as her chair before, and looked out at the kitchen garden in the cold morning light and did not say anything. He read, she thought. This became, without either of them quite deciding it, a routine. She learned things about him slowly, the way you learn things about a place by being in it long enough. He did not eat much in the mornings. He drank his coffee very black and very hot. He read quickly. He went through books at a pace she had not seen in anyone else. But he also went back to the same books repeatedly, which suggested he was not reading purely for information. He did not speak about the war. She had not expected him to. But sometimes he would be still for longer than seemed natural, looking at something that was not in the room, and she understood that whatever he was seeing, it was not the library. She recognized that quality of stillness. She had seen it in men who came back over the years, and in her mother in the last months when the illness had taken her somewhere. Evangeline could not follow. She did not try to pull him back. She was not that kind of person, and she did not think he wanted that, and she understood, perhaps better than he expected anyone to understand, the necessity of sometimes being allowed to be somewhere else. What she did, instead, was simply continue to be there, present, quiet, not performing anything. She thought, once, that he noticed this, noticed the quality of her silence, the way it was not awkward or waiting or demanding. He glanced at her over the edge of his book, with an expression she could not quite interpret. Then he looked back down. She told herself this was irrelevant. She was not here for the Duke. Prentice came on a Tuesday. She knew it was a planned visit. Cook had been asked to prepare lunch, which meant someone had given notice, and she made sure to be elsewhere when he arrived, occupied with linens at the far end of the house. She had no reason to believe Prentice would recognize her under the cap and the plain dress and the reddened hands. But she did not want to test that belief unnecessarily. She heard about the visit from Betsy later. Prentice had been in with the Duke for most of the morning. There had been raised voices, which was unusual. Betsy had never heard raised voices in this house before. And then a long silence, and then Prentice had left before lunch was served. What were they arguing about? Evangeline asked. Betsy shrugged. Oswald couldn't make it out properly. Something about an agreement. Something about papers. Evangeline kept her expression still. His Grace was not pleased, Betsy added. Oswald said he looked, well, he said it was like watching something decide to be cold. Does that make sense? It made a great deal of sense to Evangeline. She lay awake that night for a long time. In the morning, she went to the library. He was already there. He was not reading. He was standing at the window looking out at the kitchen garden, his hands behind his back, in the posture of a man who has made a decision and is waiting for the moment to act on it. She almost left. She should have left. Instead, she said quietly, "Your Grace." He turned. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I should have told you before. I was not certain I could trust you, and I apologize for that." He looked at her for a moment. His expression was, as usual, very still. "You had better sit down," he said, "and tell me." She sat down. She told him. Not all of it. Not at first. She told him who she was. She told him about her mother. She told him about the solicitor's letter and the private agreement and the transfer. She told him she had come here because she had nowhere else to go and no other way to get answers, and that she had written the reference herself and she understood if he needed to dismiss her. When she finished, she looked at her hands, which were not shaking, though they wanted to. He was quiet for long enough that she thought she had misjudged this entirely. Then he said, "I know." She looked up. "Not all of it," he said. "I didn't know who you were, but I knew something was wrong with the agreement. I've known for some months." He paused. "That is what Prentice and I were discussing yesterday." She waited. "Your stepbrother presented me with documents last year," he said, "pertaining to a debt my father allegedly owed his. He said the private agreement was made to settle that debt and that the transfer of your mother's estate was part of the settlement." He looked at her steadily. "I do not believe that is accurate. My father was not a man who left debts, and the amount involved the amount does not correspond to any debt I can find record of." "Then why?" She stopped. "Because I did not yet have proof," he said, "and without proof I could not accuse your stepbrother of anything. I have been attempting to obtain the original documentation from Mr. Alderton for 3 months. Prentice has been." A pause obstructive. She absorbed this slowly. "You were already looking into it," she said. "Yes." She thought about the nights she had lain awake trying to work out how to approach him, afraid he would not believe her, afraid he would take Prentice's side, afraid she was entirely alone in this. She thought about the months she had spent in Halifax, certain that no one with any power to help her would choose to use it. She looked at him across the library that had been her mother's and said, "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because it was wrong. Because your mother was a good woman who trusted people she should not have trusted. Because—" He stopped, and something shifted in his expression that she had not seen there before. "Because I had met you," he said, "when you were a girl before the war. And you were kind to my horse when he threw a shoe in your drive, and you were waiting for no one to notice, and it seemed to me then that you deserved more than this." She had no idea what to say to that. She had spent so long expecting people to be transactional, to want something in return for every kindness, that she had forgotten it was possible to simply be remembered well. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I'm sorry I doubted you. You had every reason to doubt me," he said. "You didn't know me. I know you now," she said. "A little." Something in his face shifted again, barely perceptible, but she had learned over these early mornings to read the very small movements. A slight easing, the way a held breath releases. "A little," he agreed. It took 2 more months. The documentation, when it was finally produced, through a combination of legal pressure, a letter from the Duke's own solicitor in London, and what Evangeline later understood to have been a rather direct conversation between the Duke and Prentice, in which the Duke had apparently been extremely clear about the consequences of continued obstruction, was not what Prentice had claimed. There was no record of any debt between the two families. There was a private agreement, yes, but it had been signed only by her stepfather, not by his Grace's father, and it referred to a future arrangement that had never been finalized. It had, in short, no legal standing whatsoever. Evangeline sat in the solicitor's office in Edinburgh on a cold December afternoon and listened to Mr. Alderton explain this to her in his very dry, very precise way, and she felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not happy, exactly, or not only happy. It was more like the way the air feels after a long rain, cleared, as if something that had been pressing down for months had finally lifted. The trust would be restored. The personal estate would be returned. It would take time. These things always took time. But the outcome was not in doubt. She thanked Mr. Alderton. She shook hands with His Grace's solicitor, a brisk woman from Edinburgh who had handled the legal aspects with an efficiency that Evangeline deeply admired. She stepped out into the December street. The Duke was waiting outside. He had come north for the meeting, and she had told him twice that he didn't need to, and he had come anyway. He was standing with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the street. He turned when she came out. "Well," he said. "Restored," she said. He nodded once, and she saw, very briefly, quickly, something in his face that was almost relief, as if he had been waiting for this too, as if it had mattered to him in a way that went beyond simple justice. She thought about that. She thought about the early mornings in the library, and the quiet that neither of them had needed to fill, and the way he had said, "You were kind to my horse," as if he had been carrying that detail for years, without knowing quite what to do with it. "Thank you for everything you did. I know you didn't have to." "No," he said. "I wanted to." She looked at him in the cold Edinburgh light, this man who had come back from a war with too many shadows and not enough sleep, and had quietly, without telling anyone, been trying to set something right. She thought that perhaps, not today, and not easily, she might like to know him better. "Will you walk?" she said. "I think I'd like to walk a little before we go back." He looked surprised, just slightly, then the surprise softened into something else. "Yes," he said, "I would like that." They walked along the December street, not particularly close, not saying very much, and the cold air was clean and the light was low and pale, and Evangeline thought that this, just this, was enough for now, more than she had expected to have, more than she had allowed herself to want. She did not know what came next. She knew the estate would take time to restore, and the legal process was slow, and there were things that would need to be rebuilt that could not be rebuilt quickly. She knew she had been living under a false name in a kitchen for 2 months, and that she would need to decide, very soon, what version of herself she was going to be from here. But she also knew that the roses at Caldwell House had still been blooming in October, which was later than they had any right to, and that some things turned out to be more persistent than anyone had expected. She thought she might be one of them.